As a breakout hit on Steam, Palworld is also available to play on Xbox systems in a preview build right now via Game Pass. It's free to play, downloadable on not just Xbox Series X and S consoles, but surprisingly, even the older base Xbox One and One X systems, all of which are in focus for this quick look today. In summary, Palworld is an Unreal Engine 5 release from developer Pocket Pair, blending the survival aspects of games like Ark Survival with the open-world monster hunting of Pokemon. Specifically, it takes Pokemon Legends Arceus from 2022 as the main point of reference. The template for seamless exploration, capturing, and battling creatures is recreated closely, and yes, it's this similarity to Pokemon that has clearly been a topic of some controversy given so many of its ideas and creatures bear more than just a passing resemblance to Game Freak's own designs. But back to the topic at hand. Just how does the game look and run on Xbox Series X, Series S, Xbox One X, and the over-decade-old base Xbox One? How close are they to hitting their target 60 FPS, given the frame rate is unlocked on all four? And how do Palworld's visuals scale from the most powerful machine to the weakest? Let's find out. Before we get into the frame rate tests, a quick word on the tech fundamentals. Despite being an open-world Unreal Engine 5 game, Palworld somehow fits into a small 6GB install, or 5GB on the base Xbox One machines. Also, despite the huge success it's having on Steam, it's worth stressing that this is most definitely in an early access state. It's a preview build. The game has bugs, and many of them. Mostly, these are in the collision detection, clipping, and animation territory, and so you'll see creatures and NPCs get stuck in the world's geometry, jittering on the spot as they try to escape an eternity trapped in place. You'll see creatures floating mid-air, and even rocketing into space for no reason at all. Also, while the world is easy on the eye, with a similar aesthetic to Breath of the Wild, complete with ragdoll physics and a cloud simulation effect, there are some rough spots. Even on Series X, we're stuck with muddy, low-resolution textures at points, and look to the distance and there's aggressive pop-in on geometry too. More of a critical point though is the general stability of the game. Sadly, as it stands on console, the game is prone to crashes as of version 0.1.1. After 8 hours of testing, every Xbox machine has abruptly closed the game executable at some stage. There's no error message here, we just go straight to the Xbox dash and have to start the game all over again. So with that in mind, let's kick off by looking at each Xbox in turn, from the most powerful to the least. Series X is up first of course, and right away we're gunning for 60 frames per second. It's V-Synced too, which means there's no screen tearing on show, but broadly speaking, the game just isn't optimized well enough to lock at 60 FPS right now on Series X. Rather, it's usually between 40 to 50 FPS, where the only point where we actually really hit that top 60Hz line is by looking right at the sky. And for such a simplistic looking game, you'd certainly hope big improvements are on their way once the game leaves early access. The native resolution also bears mention. Series X runs at 2880 by 1620, which is a fixed resolution target in the current build. Which is a surprise actually. So often we see dynamic resolution scaling used in Unreal Engine 5 games to adjust to GPU load, altering the resolution to the situation, but not here. Whether you look right at the sky to achieve 60 FPS or run through a taxing area running at under 40 FPS, this fixed 1620p does Palworld's performance no favours. It needs flexibility to adapt to the open world action or the chaos that ensues in battle. As a quick fix, enabling a DRS system could be one way at least to improve the frame rate on Series X, especially so once we get to this more demanding open field area leading to the church at the end. This whole region in fact takes us well into the 30 to 40 FPS range, which is hardly ideal, and we may as well have a 30 FPS cap in place at this point, given it falls outside the VRR window for supporting displays. The abundance of grass, the roaming creatures, it all plummets Series X to its lowest figures. Now, if the developer were to set it at a dynamic range of 1080p to 4K for example, I'd expect we'd see a significant uptick in performance. 60 FPS would be much more attainable, even if yes, it does mean image quality takes a hit at those moments. Ideally, the solution will involve smarter optimizations to Series X though, especially judging by the state of the obvious geometry pop-in and the game's often low-quality shadows and textures. There's a lot more work to be done, in other words. Though, as an aside, the game does at least use screen space reflections, SSR, on Series X, and impressively, SSR is kept on every other Xbox platform. Moving over to Xbox Series S next, there are a few surprises. Firstly, the frame rate. It's at times much improved over the Series X reading, with the opening area running at 50 to 60 FPS overall. Sometimes it even glances the maximum 60 FPS for a few seconds, which in itself is around a 10 FPS leap over the Series X version. Once we get to that open field region with the church at the end, we're also looking at an upgrade, if a more marginal one. There are dips into the 30s on the 4 teraflop machine here, but it's also more often operating above the 40 FPS line across the planes. So, given we're more typically between 40 to 60 FPS, anyone using a variable refresh rate display will get some joy out of the unlocked 60 FPS output of the machine. Simply put then, Series S is the best performing Xbox machine of the quartet, except the reason for the frame rate advantage does come down to visual sacrifices and a significant drop in resolution. We're at a native 1280 by 720 this time, and again, this 720p figure is fixed in place. In terms of visual settings meanwhile, textures and shadows are a match for Series X, even at their ugliest points. We get SSR into the bargain again, but there is a visible drop in draw distance for geometry. Combine that with the worse image quality, and the sacrifice to get closer to 60 FPS is quite dear. Okay, what about the last-gen Xbox One X? Bearing in mind that, on paper, the One X sports a more powerful GPU than the Series S, but also factoring in its weaker CPU, the turnout for Palworld shows a mixture of fortunes. On the plus side, Xbox One X is able to render at a higher, native 1080p resolution. Again, this is a fixed value regardless of the situation, but already this gives us a marked upgrade in image quality over Series S's 720p. Also, the performance level, early on, in the sections where you first learn to put together your first workbench, is pretty respectable. 50 to 60 FPS is the typical range as we descend down to the lower planes. Except the One X has very clear drawbacks visually. As we migrate down this hill, its clear texture resolution at its very worst is of much lower quality. It's a significant downgrade from Series S, and likewise there's also a lowered draw distance setting for geometry, trees, and grass all round. So note how this open field area presents as a much more barren stretch as we charge ahead, with grass essentially fizzling into view much closer to the player. Xbox One X takes big sacrifices visually then. As impressive as its push to 1080p is, the settings for textures and world LODs take a big hit, which leads us to problem number 2. The overall frame rate. Despite the promising start at 50 to 60 FPS, entering more complex open areas drags us well into the 20s for prolonged spells. It's a level of performance I've not yet seen on Series X or S, and at its worst, we're looking at 17 FPS right near this church. In fairness, this doesn't represent the majority of play on One X, but it's certainly true of spots with lots of roaming creatures. Added to that, there's a big issue with hitching on One X. Put this down to CPU contention, or possibly a reliance on its mechanical hard drive, but any interaction with the menus, or even simply running across busy areas, triggers this big frame time spike. A huge chunk of frames are dropped in a sequence, which disrupts the already low 20 FPS reading. All of which brings us to the base Xbox One, or the One S model in this case. In a nutshell, all the visual cutbacks on the One X apply once again. You have the lowered grass and geometry LODs, you get significantly pared back texture quality, you have low grass density across the ground, even fully loaded in, and in terms of resolution, we get a native 960 by 540. In terms of image quality, this really is the inevitable low point for Palworld on console, and the frame rate is also only just salvageable at between 15 to 35 FPS. In fairness, most of the early tutorial sections hover at around that 35 FPS mark, but once you embark on the first open field area, it's practically on a par with 1X's readout. We go well into the 20s, and then, at worst, 16 FPS comes in at the very lowest point around the church. In the event then that you're curious about Palworld during the ongoing hype, in the event that you've clung on to your trusty Xbox One for all these years, be braced for a great many cutbacks here. And that's not to speak on the hitches, intraversal or menu use, which is again a sore point on the base Xbox One. Much of this is expected of last-gen ports. We're not expecting miracles out of Xbox One, it's just surprising to see Palworld's already uneven frame rate and visuals on Series machines getting pared back even further. For perspective then, and for a bit of fun, this is how the game scales between the extremes, between the most powerful Xbox machine of today, Series X, and the base Xbox One model. It's 540p on left versus 1620p on right, which speaks for itself in terms of image quality here. The frankly huge divide in texture asset quality, grass draw, and geometry draw also sticks out starkly by contrast. In many cases, it's fair to put this down to the early access nature of the build, in that not all textures look quite this bad. The Xbox One version viewed on its own also struggles with pop-in quite glaringly, and to a great extent it's an issue with One X as well. Alongside the hitching and poor image quality, this is the most glaring part of the package right now, and it's where switching to the Series X really makes the biggest difference visually. Even with its clear rough edges, Palworld is most obviously optimized towards new generation Series X, S and PC hardware so far, and while being in early access does encourage a certain benefit of the doubt to those last-gen Xbox One versions, I'm not optimistic that they'll be transformed with ease. There's a lot of work to do before any final release, a lot to address in those sub 20 FPS frame rates and the regular hitching. Speaking more generally about the game though, Palworld is a fascinating exercise in imitation. There's a lot of direct borrowing going on, from Pokemon Arceus to Ark Survival and Zelda Breath of the Wild. To an extent, mimicking another game's mechanics isn't unusual. The games industry has, after all, historically thrived off imitation and iteration of working ideas. At times, imitation helps to move the needle forward, but the degree to which developer Pocket Pair has created a likeness of so many Pokemon designs is more of an issue here. It doesn't just entail its mechanics, but also potentially the visual design too. That aside, the game's surprise success does prove one thing, that there is a demand for a Pokemon-style game on PC, a next-gen Pokemon if you like, built on more advanced tech with a networked multiplayer element. And for all its blatant borrowing of ideas, it'll be interesting to see how Palworld evolves beyond this early access state. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.